I mean, and what he learned, I read an old issue of our in the 50s, which talks about Sassetta and Giovanni di Paolo. And I mean, to compare what he wrote in that time with what he wrote a man who's really developed and learned.
I mean, no, I didn't know you he is at the same time able to paint very large.
Have you been to Groningen before, Bill? Have you been to Groningen before? Kind of interesting city. Did you get to walk around?
I walked through park yesterday.
Love the bicycle. It's a great There was a BBC crew staying in the same hotel with art crews. They're making a film about transportation of the future.
Hello, sorry for a moment. My name is Piet Brinkmans.
Oh, hi.
Nee, maar het zal ongetwijfeld nog wel komen.
Eerste dag?
Ja, zo ik ben. Maar
You think I could just sit down there?
Yeah.
Thank you.
In particular, the two speakers of tonight. The combination is unusual, having a professor of linguistics and a secretary of defense on one platform. I assume that Professor Chomsky's interest in war is as profound as Mr. Bolkestein's interest in the use of language. But what they certainly have in common is their passion for politics. I'm afraid that the two distinguished speakers of tonight have serious differences of opinion. And that is exactly the reason why they have been invited. Most of you will know that Professor Chomsky and Mr. Bolkestein have conducted a fierce and sometimes ferocious debate in NRC Handelsblad. They have been disputing virtually every fact the other mentioned, and I have no illusion that they will agree on the evidence this evening. One of our readers wrote me a letter in despair and said, with a variation on Orwell, how is it possible that two people know so much and agree on so little? What Professor Chomsky calls brainwashing under freedom, or manufacturing consent, is to Mr. Bolkestein obtaining the necessary consensus in a democratic society. The one considers the media basically independent, despite some distortions and shortcomings. The other sees the media as a willing instrument of indoctrination for the ruling classes, the elite. In the latter's view, only limited discussion is allowed, provided the fundamentals of the existing capitalistic system remain intact. Bolkestein basically accepts the democratic capitalistic state. Chomsky thinks and possibly dreams about a different democracy in which the creative talents of the people are better used. I come back to Orwell. He wondered how it is possible that beliefs are so often firmly held, completely without foundation, and often plainly at variance with obvious facts about the world. Possibly this debate will show us how Orwellian our two guests of tonight are. Now some words about the order of the discussion. All parties concerned have, after long and polite negotiations, agreed on a rather strict structure. Each of them starts with an exposition of 25 minutes without interruption. That means interrupting each other. Secondly, they have 5 minutes for reply and rejoinder, again without interruptions. The third exchange is of 7.5 minutes each with interruptions. And finally, both gentlemen will have 2.5 minutes for their closing remarks, again without interruptions, and I hope much will then be clear to us. In order not to confuse the debate unnecessarily, I would like to ask the public not to interrupt. Your chance will come later. Well, the order of debate resembles a genetic code. It is CBBC, CBBC, which means that Mr. Chomsky is going to start. Mr. Chomsky, may I invite you?
Does that mean I should start?
Yes, please.
Thanks. Don't hesitate to interrupt. Well, this evening's program is scheduled as a debate, which puzzled me all the way through. There are some problems. One problem is that no proposition has been set forth. As I understand debate, people are supposed to advocate something and oppose something. Rather more sensibly, a topic has been proposed for discussion. The topic is manufacture of consent, and I think it's a topic that merits careful thought because it bears directly on fundamental problems about democracy and freedom, and what I'm going to do is talk about the topic. Well, let's begin by being clear about the notion under discussion. The phrase manufacture of consent was coined by the influential American journalist Walter Lippmann. Writing in 1921, he described, I'm quoting him now, a revolution in the practice of democracy as the manufacture of consent has become a self-conscious art and a regular organ of popular government. He thinks the revolution is justified. The reason is, I'm quoting, that the common interests very largely elude public opinion entirely and can be managed only by a specialized class whose personal interests reach beyond the locality. The common people, he continued, are a bewildered herd, and they can be at most the interested spectators of action. In short, only an elite can deal with the problems that lie beyond the common understanding, and the revolutionary new techniques of propaganda and mass communications provide the means to ensure that the bewildered herd will not interfere where they don't belong, namely in the public arena. Now, how does Lippmann, that's the concept, how does Lippmann's specialized class gain the power to manufacture consent for the public policy that they design? Well, the answer is rather simple. Those who control resources and investment decisions and so on have the power to define their special interests as the common interest, and they can influence rather substantially the selection and the actions of the corporate and state and cultural managers who constitute the specialized class. Under these conditions, which are largely satisfied in practice, Lippmann's assertions become meaningful and even familiar. In fact, they are a modern version of the dictum of the founding fathers of American democracy that, I'm quoting, the people who own the country ought to govern it, quoting John Jay. The Bolshevik overtones of Lippmann's conception are evident. Lippmann's specialized class corresponds to the Leninist vanguard of revolutionary intellectuals. His manufacture of consent is their agitprop. The Bolsheviks also regarded the masses as ignorant and incompetent, and they quickly dismantled organs of popular control. They relied upon relatively crude means of manufacture of consent or force when these did not suffice. Now, the phrase manufacture of consent is relatively new, but the concept is old. It takes on different forms as social conditions vary, and it's rather enlightening to see how common a theme it is in modern history. Since the origins of modern democracy in the 17th century England, those who describe themselves as men of best quality have been deeply concerned over the attempts of the ignorant and stupid masses, the bewildered herd, to control their own affairs. One commentator in the 17th century warned that the popular Democrats were arousing the rascal multitude and rabble against their natural rulers, the lords, gentry, ministers, lawyers, rich and peaceable men. They were revealing the mysteries of government to the common people, and thereby making them so curious and so arrogant that they will never find humility enough to submit to a civil rule. The rabble rejected both of the contestants for power in the Civil War. They did not want to be ruled by king or parliament, they said, but by countrymen like ourselves. Their pamphlets explained that it will never be a good world while knights and gentlemen make us laws that are chosen for fear and do but oppress us and do not know the people's swords. And these, in fact, have been quite common themes through modern history since. Walter Lippmann, to go back to him, was writing in a particular social context, which gives meaning to his notions, his thoughts. It was a period of severe domestic repression. Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare. That was a harsh attack on labor, on freedom of speech, and democratic politics. The repression was launched in fear that the Bolshevik Revolution, shortly before, would inspire the ignorant and incapable mass of humanity to become masters by virtue of their overwhelming numbers. I'm quoting Woodrow Wilson, Secretary of State, who's expressing the standard fear of democracy. The liberal intellectual community at the time was much impressed with their successful service in Wilson's propaganda campaign to induce a generally pacifist population to join the European war. As they put it, they were proud of having imposed their will upon a reluctant or indifferent majority, using such measures as what they called historical engineering, that is, shaping the facts of history so as to serve the needs of state power. It was a task undertaken by a group of eminent historians who formed a national board of historical service. The intellectual class also relayed fabrications about Hun atrocities and other matters that were devised by the British Ministry of Information, which secretly defined its task as to direct the thought of most of the world. The Wilson administration created its own agitprop agency to direct the thought of the population at home. Propaganda and its merits were in the air, along with fear of what was called the mass of humanity. And it was in this context that Lippmann spoke of the revolutionary new methods of manufacture of consent. Sorry, I've been talking all day. Wilson's propaganda agency, first in American history, was the precursor of the far more elaborate program of the Reagan administration to control domestic debate by manipulation and deceit. When this secret and illegal program was finally exposed, High officials of the administration described it as the kind of operation that the military conducts in enemy territory. The terminology is apt. It captures the attitude toward the general public, an enemy that has to be subdued. The corporate world was also much impressed with the new techniques of engineering of consent, the term that was devised by the leading figure of the public relations industry, which underwent a rapid expansion in the post-World War I years, dedicated to the task of controlling the public mind, as executives put it. This huge industry offers its services for engineering consent to government policy, while also, in their words, educating the American people about the economic facts of life to ensure a favorable climate for business. Industry manuals explain, quoting, that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. It is the intelligent minorities which need to make use of propaganda continuously and systematically. And, of course, they do so by virtue of their private power. It's unnecessary to add. Now, all of this is taken very seriously. There's been a long and very self-conscious campaign of business to subdue particularly the labor movement by these methods. In 1938, the board of directors of the National Association of Manufacturers described what it called the hazard-facing industrialists in the newly realized political power of the masses. Unless their thinking is directed, it warned, we are definitely headed for adversity. And great efforts were made to redirect their thinking. By 1954, Daniel Bell, who was then an editor for the leading business magazine Fortune, wrote that it has been industry's prime concern in the post-war years to change the climate of opinion ushered in by the Depression. This so-called free enterprise campaign, he puts free enterprise in quotes, indicating that it's a fraud, which it is. This free enterprise campaign has two essential aims: to re-win the loyalty of the worker, which now goes to the union, and to halt creeping socialism, which means the mildly reformist capitalism of the New Deal. The scale of business public relations, Bell goes on, was staggering through advertising in press and radio, forced training programs for workers, and other means. The effects were seen. They were seen in legislation to constrain union activity, the attack on independent thought that's often mislabeled McCarthyism, and the elimination of any articulate challenge to business domination. Several years earlier, in 1947, a State Department public relations officer remarked that smart public relations has paid off, as it has before and will again. Public opinion is not moving to the right, it has been moved cleverly to the right. While the rest of the world has moved to the left, has admitted labor into government, has passed liberalized legislation, the United States has become anti-social change, anti-economic change, anti-labor. In fact, the situation in Europe was more complex than he indicates, but I can't go into that here. Lippmann's thoughts on manufacture of consent have frequently been reiterated, a few years later, for example, by the influential moralist and foreign affairs advisor Reinhold Niebuhr, who is much revered by George Kennan, the Kennedy intellectuals, and many others, called the official establishment theologian. He wrote that rationality belongs to the cool observers. That's Lippmann's specialized class. Because of the stupidity of the average man, he continued, the cool observers must provide necessary illusions and emotionally potent oversimplifications for the stupid masses. Harold Lasswell explained in the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences that we must not succumb to democratic dogmatisms